Hi, everybody. This is Radio Free Mormon, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode is how the Book of Mormon actually ends up destroying Mormonism. Now, it's a strange thing because the Book of Mormon is touted by the Mormon Church as being the foundation and even the chief cornerstone of Mormonism. And yet, there are a number of ways, actually, in which the Book of Mormon destroys, contradicts, undermines modern Mormonism, the religion that is based upon the Book of Mormon. It's an interesting fact, and yet it appears to be true. Now, there are a number of ways in which the Book of Mormon undermines Mormonism, but we're just going to go after one issue in this episode, and that issue has to do with spiritual gifts. Let me go ahead and put up the title slide for tonight's episode. It is called Spiritual Gifts in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon condemns Mormonism. So there is the title slide. Now, this particular podcast and this particular study, because this is going to be a textual analysis of the Book of Mormon as compared with the Bible, you may remember that we did a very similar thing only a few weeks ago with David P. Wright's paper that was published in 1993, talking about how the book of Hebrews, or the epistle to the Hebrews, was used in the Book of Mormon. It's the paper that got him excommunicated. And a number of the things I learned from studying that paper, the tools that were presented by David P. Wright in his paper, all of a sudden, I'm able to start seeing things in the Book of Mormon that I had not really seen or seen so clearly before. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight. You remember that his paper was called, In Plain Terms That We May Understand, Joseph Smith's Transformation of Hebrews in Alma 12 through 13. Well, here is going to be my paper tonight. The Book of Mormon condemns Mormonism, Joseph Smith's transformation of 1 Corinthians 13 in Moroni 7 by Radio Free Mormon. So this paper, this study, this podcast has been inspired really by my reading of David P. Wright's paper. If I had not read that paper, if I had not studied it deeply enough to be able to present it to you in a podcast, which I did a few weeks ago, if I had not done that, if I had not learned those things, this podcast would not be happening. So I've got to dedicate this podcast to David P. Wright. Now, I am not for a second trying to say that I am anywhere near his level, his caliber at all, okay? I am an amateur. So I sort of feel like the little drummer boy going to give my gift to Jesus and playing my drums for David P. Wright. But I'm going to play it the best I can, damn it. And here it goes, all right? I think that I found something of significance, something that is a contribution to Mormon studies. I have to say, I don't know if this has been seen before. I don't know if this has been published on before. All I know is that I have not seen it anywhere. And it struck me while I was preparing for the prior podcast that I did about David P. Wright. So here we go. First thing I want to say is, my audience continually surprises me, and usually it's for the best. I put out a 4-hour plus podcast where I read David P. Wright's own words as he described the events surrounding his excommunication in 1994, which came as a result of writing that paper that I put on the screen earlier. It was meaningful to me, and yet it was over 4 hours long. And I thought, this is going to bore everybody. Nobody's going to be interested in watching this. And much to my surprise, over 24,000 views on this particular episode. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I'm just very impressed that people would be interested enough in this episode to watch. It was meaningful to me, so of course it's gratifying when other people find it meaningful as well. And then I did that second podcast, that follow-up podcast only a couple of weeks ago. It was the one about David P. Wright's actual paper where I presented the nuts and bolts of the paper. That one was only an hour and 16 minutes long. And yet I thought, man, nobody's going to care about this. This is dry. It's boring. It's textual analysis of the Book of Mormon. And yet 15,000 views. So once again, I'm very, very impressed by my audience, your interest in these things. And so I'm very excited to present to you what it is that I've discovered in the Book of Mormon using the same tools as David P. Wright. Now, this is a slide. It's in purple. It's a slide that I used in that prior podcast, the one where I presented about David P. Wright's paper. And here is where it started to click for me, what I'm going to present to you today about the spiritual gifts and how it is that the Book of Mormon, when it talks about spiritual gifts, condemns modern Mormonism. First off, I had this slide from the last show. It says the most popular and influential New Testament chapters are generally considered to be Sermon on the Mount, the Faith, Hope, and Charity chapter from 1 Corinthians 13, Gifts of the Spirit from 1 Corinthians 12, and Gifts of the Spirit, the list of gifts of the Spirit in the long ending of Mark. Mark chapter 16, verses 17 through 18 is where we have those gifts of the Spirit. There's the Sermon on the Mount, and where it shows up in the Book of Mormon and 3rd Nephi 12 through 14. And here is 1 Corinthians 13 on the right. This is the one about charity. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up. You can see that there in 1 Corinthians 13:4. And over here in Moroni 7, the author of the Book of Mormon is copying a lot of this language directly from the New Testament chapter of 1 Corinthians 13. We talked about that the last time. I think that's beyond dispute. Even apologists don't try and say that it's not really the same language. They'll come up with other explanations to attempt to explain it away, but usually they won't say, well, this is just a coincidence, because it's so obviously copied and there is such an obvious borrowing going on. So that's 1 Corinthians 13 showing up in Moroni 7. We also have the same thing going on with 1 Corinthians 12, which contains a list of the gifts of the Spirit. And we find that replicated in large part over here in Moroni chapter 10. The last chapter in the Book of Mormon is largely devoted to borrowing from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And finally, the long ending of Mark, we find that in Mark 16, 17 through 18, it has the list of the gifts of the Spirit. And this is very important because it also links having the gifts of the Spirit with being saved. It says, and these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Remember, these signs shall follow them that believe. So if you believe, you will have these signs following you. If you don't have these signs following you, well, apparently you don't believe. So you see how that's built in to this passage in the long ending of Mark. By the long ending of Mark, I mean a long ending that was apparently, according to the vast majority of biblical scholars, it was added on to the ending of Mark, the original ending of Mark, at a later date. It was not part of the original gospel. And this was quoted word for word, Mark 16, 17 through 18, in the long ending of Mark, not part of the original gospel, gets quoted word for word in Mormon 9:24. So what we can see from this is that the author of the Book of Mormon, and I'll just say the Book of Mormon for shorthand, okay? I think it was Joseph Smith. Other people may have different opinions. It doesn't really matter for purposes of this analysis. We're looking at the text. What it is this. Of the 4 primary and very famous chapters in the New Testament that get copied and borrowed from and worked with in the Book of Mormon, 3 of the 4 have to do with spiritual gifts. Now, the first one's the Sermon on the Mount, not really about spiritual gifts. But the second one is Faith, Hope, and Charity from 1 Corinthians 13, gets replicated in Moroni 7, definitely about spiritual gifts. Third, Gifts of the Spirit, the list of gifts of the Spirit, which we find in 1 Corinthians 12, and then borrowed from and replicated in Moroni chapter 10, obviously about gifts of the Spirit. And finally, number 4, that long ending section from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 17 through 18, replicated word for word, by the way, in Mormon 9. Obviously, that deals with gifts of the Spirit and significantly links having the gifts of the Spirit following you to believing in Jesus Christ. So in the gifts of the Spirit section, number 4 in Mark, an argument can be made, as I've alluded to before, that if you have the gifts of the Spirit, it means that you have belief. It means that you have salvation, because without belief, there is no salvation. But without belief, there's also no spiritual gifts. Therefore, the presence or absence of spiritual gifts tells us something important. And what it tells us is, if you have spiritual gifts, you're saved. If you don't have spiritual gifts, you're damned, right? Because one means you believe, and the second means you don't believe. If you believe, you're saved. If you don't believe, you're damned. And this is a way to tell. I do note here that Mormon chapter 9, in which the gifts of the Spirit from Mark occur, Moroni 7, in which the Faith, Hope, and Charity chapter occurs, and Moroni 10, in which the list of the gifts of the Spirit occur, are all in the last part of the Book of Mormon. Indeed, this seems to have been a pressing issue on the mind of the author of the Book of Mormon at the time this was being dictated. The gifts of the Spirit were so important to Joseph Smith that he replicated the gifts of the Spirit from 1 Corinthians 12, not only in Moroni chapter 10, but he also went back to it in the Doctrine and Covenants. 3 of the 4 major New Testament passages incorporated into the Book of Mormon deal with the importance of spiritual gifts. I think I've already showed that. It seems that this issue is of importance to the author, and especially at that particular time. However, we know it continued to be of importance to Joseph Smith as he incorporated the list of spiritual gifts from 1 Corinthians 12 into what became Doctrine and Covenants section 46. And he did this in 1831. And here's the passage from D&C 46. It starts with verse 17. And you can see there, once again, a list of the very familiar gifts of the Spirit. And again, verily I say unto you, to some is given by the Spirit of God the word of wisdom, to another is given the word of knowledge, that all may be taught to be wise and to have knowledge. And again, to some it is given to have faith to be healed, and to others it is given to have faith to heal. And again, to some is given the working of miracles, and to others it is given to prophesy. Is this sounding familiar? This is from 1 Corinthians 12. It's also from Moroni chapter 10, and it's also from Doctrine and Covenants section 46. Obviously, the gifts of the Spirit are a very important issue in Mormonism, a very important issue to Joseph Smith. And it goes on. And to others, the discerning of spirits. And again, it is given to some to speak with tongues, and to another is given the interpretation of tongues, right? We always have that following the speaking in tongues. The interpretation comes afterward. And all these gifts come from God for the benefit of the children of God. And that is from Doctrine and Covenants, section 46, verses 17 through 26. Okay, so let's look at Moroni chapter 7. Let's focus on this particular chapter, because this is where 1 Corinthians 13 is borrowed from and replicated, or at least portions of that chapter are replicated in Moroni 7. And that's what I'm going to be doing, is looking at this closely, seeing what it is that Joseph Smith, or the author of the Book of Mormon, is doing with 1 Corinthians 13. Moroni chapter 7 is presented as a sermon by Mormon, the prophet Mormon, in which he preaches that if we do not have faith enough to have spiritual gifts, we do not have enough faith to be saved. Therefore, if you do not experience spiritual gifts, you are damned for lack of faith. Doesn't that sound like the passage from the long ending of Mark that we've quoted? So, very simply put, spiritual gifts equals salvation. No spiritual gifts equals damnation. What could be simpler? The problem for me has always been in following that thread of the argument in Moroni chapter 7. And you may be wondering why it is that it's so darn hard to follow. I'll get to that in a minute, okay? But first off, here is the argument as it's set forth in Moroni 7, verse 27. And you can see I'm going to quote from portions of verse 27, verse 29, verse 37, and then all of verse 38. And you can see that once I cut out all the extraneous material in this passage, it will make sense. Okay, let me read this, all right? Moroni 7:27. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, have miracles ceased because Christ hath ascended into heaven? Question mark. Nay, neither have angels ceased to minister unto the children of men. For it is by faith that miracles are wrought, and it is by faith that angels appear and minister unto men. Wherefore, if these things have ceased, woe be unto the children of men, for it is because of unbelief, and all is vain. See, if they don't have belief, they don't have the spiritual gifts, all is vain. Why is all vain if you don't have spiritual gifts? Verse 38 answers that question. For no man can be saved, according to the words of Christ, save they shall have faith in his name. Wherefore, if these things have ceased, these miracles, these visitations of angels, if these things have ceased, then has faith ceased also. And awful is the state of man, for they are as though there had been no redemption made. Now you can see how clear that argument is in Moroni chapter 7. Once I cut away all the extraneous stuff that occurs in this passage. And the extraneous language is the vast majority of language in this passage. In fact, I made a slide that shows you exactly how much language is not really related to this argument. And here it is. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can thank me later. But here is the passage in Moroni chapter 7 from verse 27 all the way through verse 38. And if you can see the parts that are underlined, the parts that I have underlined in verse 27 and in verse 29 and in verse 37 and in verse 38, those are the parts that I had in that prior slide. That's all that's necessary to understand the argument. So why is it that there's so much fat in this particular chapter? Well, that is going to end up being its own separate episode because I began getting into that as well. I think there's a very, very simple reason as to why it is that there is so much additional material in and amongst the straightforward argument. In fact, this additional material makes it difficult, sometimes extremely difficult, to understand what the argument really is. And I'm going to give you a brief summary of this, all right? What Joseph Smith appears to do in writing the Book of Mormon, and here I'm talking about the sermons in the Book of Mormon, not necessarily the narrative, but the sermon sections in the Book of Mormon generally go like this. They're like a bunny hopping across a field. It's the bunny hop. Na 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 hop hop hop. That's how Joseph Smith dictated the Book of Mormon. So what he appears to do is he will actually have a sermon that has a point to it. But as he goes through that sermon, he will arrive at a word that he's using or a phrase that he's using, and then he will go off on this tangent. This is the hopping part, okay? He will go off on a tangent for a short space, a medium-sized space, or even a very long space. Look at the tangent between verse 29 and verse 37. And then he will finally keep coming back to what it is that he's talking about. So if he's going along this way, if this is going along the ground, that's the sermon that he's giving us, okay? Every time the bunny hops, he's leaving the sermon to talk about something that came up in the part that he just gave us in the sermon and riff on it for a while and tell us something about that particular element of the sermon. It really doesn't necessarily even have anything to do with the main thrust of the sermon. It's just a tangent. And so he comes back down from the tangent. He'll go along a little ways on the sermon. Something else will occur in the sermon that makes Joseph Smith want to riff on that some more, another word or another phrase. And once again, he'll be hopping again and he'll be going off on another tangent. And when he comes back down onto the sermon, he'll go on the sermon for a ways until something else appeals to him, something else attractive, a shiny object that he wants to riff on, even though it may have nothing to do and frequently has nothing to do with the actual sermon that he's giving. I had thought that I was going to go into this in more depth today, but I think that what I already have is enough, and I'm going to save this for a separate day in order to demonstrate more thoroughly what it is I'm talking about. I've given you the general theory, but I want to demonstrate it in a future episode. But if you haven't heard it before, you've heard it here now. This is the bunny hop method of dictating sermons in the Book of Mormon. So going back to this slide that has the language on it, which is really all the language we need. This is actually the line along the ground that the bunny's going on. This is the main point, the main thrust of the sermon. And in between, he bunny hops all over the place. Okay, let's get back to Moroni chapter 7 and what it does with 1 Corinthians 13, which is the main point of this podcast. Here's the slide where I showed you the main argument. I think it's a very simple argument. It's easy to get your head around. You don't necessarily have to agree with it to understand the argument. So you're probably asking yourself, what is this 3x5 card doing here in the slide deck? Well, there's a story behind this 3x5 card. That is my handwriting, and I wrote this on the 3x5 card over 30 years ago. It would have been in the early 1990s. And let me tell you what's behind this and why it is that I made this list. It's titled Doctrinal Sermons. It's from the Book of Mormon. And I listed 18 different doctrinal sermons that are in the Book of Mormon. These are real sermons. They're not just sort of throwaway lines or a verse or two about maybe even a spiritual subject. But I wanted to find and identify the different sermons in the Book of Mormon because my idea was to go through the Book of Mormon and do a commentary on each of the sermons. Okay, now why did I want to do that? The reason is that I have read the Book of Mormon a number of times, certainly over 20, probably over 30 by this point. And my reading of the Book of Mormon has progressed as I have read it again and again and again. I try to read it closely. I try to read it in an interactive way where I'm trying to understand what it is that the author is saying in the text of the Book of Mormon. And when it came to the sermons in the Book of Mormon, I went through three distinct stages as a reader. The first stage was when I would get to a sermon in the Book of Mormon, I would understand some things, and then it would seem to go off in a different direction, and I would never ever be able to figure out where it was going or what it was really saying. And this happened over and over and over again. And sometimes the author of the sermon would come back to the point, but as often as not, they would not come back to the point. So these were very, very difficult sermons for me to understand what was going on. I liked what I was reading. I liked what it said about Jesus. I'm an active member. I believe it's the word of God, but I'm having a really hard time understanding it. The second stage was when I began recognizing, and this took a lot of effort and a lot of reading on my part. I'm not saying it's the same way for everybody, but for me, this was the case. As I would read these sermons more closely, I began to realize that even though these sermons, as a rule, go off on a number of tangents over the course of the sermon, the point actually does end up coming back to the point. In other words, every time there's a tangent that leads away from the main point of the sermon, the author manages to bring that tangent back into line and continue with the sermon where he left off. Now, that is remarkable to me because a lot of times I have trouble remembering what it was I was talking about if I go out on a limb and go on a tangent. If I go on a tangent, the longer that tangent is, the less likely I'm going to be able to remember where it is that I went off the tracks and get back to that point in the conversation. I don't know, maybe you have that same problem. But as I read the Book of Mormon closely and the sermons in particular, I recognized that every time the author is giving a sermon or presenting a sermon and goes off on a tangent, which happens frequently, he always seems to manage to come back to the sermon and where it is that he left off. Now, when I was reading this in my younger days, and I saw that sometimes it would come back to the point and other times it didn't seem to come back to the point, that is me recognizing leaving the point on a tangent and coming back in a brief period of time within a verse or two. I can follow that connection. But there are actually times when even an entire page will happen as a tangent, where it leaves the main point of the sermon, goes off on a tangent for even a page, many verses, and then finally comes back. Those were the ones that were very difficult for me to see. In fact, I didn't see them during my first readings of the Book of Mormon because they were so far out there that I never made the connection that it was actually coming back to the sermon. It was only through repeated, multiple close readings of the Book of Mormon that I was able to see this. And I believe that this is an important key to understanding how the sermons in the Book of Mormon were dictated. Once we understand this, I think we can see it happen over and over and over again. We have a sermon, it goes through a certain part of the sermon. There is a phrase or a word that Joseph Smith wants to riff on, which he does in a tangent. It can be a quick tangent, it can be a long tangent, but ultimately that tangent will resolve and come back to the sermon. And pretty much, I think, always comes back to the point in the sermon where Joseph Smith left off originally. It's really quite interesting. Now, even though that may have been difficult for me to figure out, I think that it probably was not as difficult for Joseph Smith to do because all you have is a relatively brief sermon, a relatively brief argument, and you're going along and you're talking about it. And then you start riffing on things that are in the sermon as they come to you. This is very similar to what I have done on this podcast when I'm reading court documents. I'll read through the court documents. The court document is the main thing, but I will find something in there that makes me think this could use some explanation, or I want to riff on this, or I want to give some additional information about this particular aspect of what I just read. And I do so, and then I come back to the court document where I left and continue to read. This is how I think Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. Not saying necessarily he was reading off of a physical piece of paper, but I'm not ruling that out either, okay? I think I've made the theory clear enough, and I look forward to the time when I will have a chance to try and substantiate that theory. Now, when it came time for me to start the study here and comparing 1 Corinthians 13 to Moroni chapter 7. I got out my triple combination for the Book of Mormon. There it is, the green leather-bound volume. And here's the Bible for 1 Corinthians 13, also produced by the church, the King James Version. And in order to find this card, this 3x5 card, remember that thing I've been telling you about? Okay, there it is with a different list of sermons. I went to this copy of the standard. This is my quadruple combination, which I got in 1984 for Christmas. 41 years ago, this coming Christmas, I got this quad from my parents. And it has a cover. And in the cover, by the way, is this zipper. Can you see this zipper? So you can put additional things there in the zipper. And that's where I went dumpster diving because I got a lot of things here in the zipper. Excuse me. Here we go. I got to take it off so I can, there, get a hold of this stuff. Oh my gosh. Look at all this stuff that I've got here. It's incredible. Let me hold it up here next to my face so you can see it. We've got all these different things that I thought were of significance back in my believing days, my apologetic days, my Bible bashing days. I've got all sorts of things in here. And yes, I found even this. Here it is, everybody. There's the actual card written by me over 30 years ago with these doctrinal sermons from the Book of Mormon in it. And here it is with me taking a picture of it and putting it up on the screen. And maybe someday I'll go through all this junk that's in my triple combination. That might make its own podcast. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there, including this particular 3x5 card. Okay, so the reason I went and got this 3x5 card is because I remembered I had sort of a dim recollection that this was not the only time in Moroni chapter 7 that the Book of Mormon makes this identical argument about faith and gifts of the Spirit. And I knew it was in a different sermon in the Book of Mormon. I couldn't remember where, so I went and found this card, which has all the sermons listed. And then when I looked down there, it occurred to me, I think it's the one from Moroni 10. In other words, the same argument made in Moroni 7 is made in Moroni chapter 10. I found the passages, and here they are. And here's the same argument, okay? Notice that this argument about gifts of the Spirit being a sign of salvation to those who have them and a sign of damnation for those who do not was important enough to the Book of Mormon that he not only wrote it in Moroni chapter 7, but also repeated the same argument in a separate sermon in Moroni chapter 10. Now, Moroni chapter 7 is supposed to be the words of Mormon. Moroni chapter 10 is supposed to be the words of his son Moroni. And here's what it says, Moroni chapter 10, verse 19 through 26. And actually, it's not 19 through 26. It's 19 and then 24, 25, and 26. And I expect that's because between verse 19 and verse 24, there's a lot of riffing going on, right? But here's the bare bones of the same argument. You'll recognize it, I'm sure. And I would exhort you, my beloved brethren, that ye remember that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's Jesus. And that all these gifts, the spiritual gifts, remember, he's given the list of the spiritual gifts in Moroni chapter 10. That's from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And here's what he says about them. And that all these gifts of which I have spoken, which are spiritual, never will be done away, even as long as the world shall stand, only according to the unbelief of the children of men. See, there's that same argument being made. And now I speak unto all the ends of the earth, that if the day cometh that the power and gifts of God shall be done away among you, it shall be because of unbelief. And woe be unto the children of men, for if this be the case, that there shall be none that doeth good among you, no, not one. By the way, this is also a key to understanding in Moroni chapter 10, that when he's talking about doing good, he's not talking about helping old ladies across the street necessarily. He's talking about the performance of spiritual gifts, at least apparently so. For if there be one among you that doeth good, he shall work by the power and gifts of God. See, there's this connection between doing good and working by the power and gifts of God. And finally, verse 26, and woe unto them who shall do these things away, the spiritual gifts away, and die, for they die in their sins, and they cannot be saved in the kingdom of God. And I speak it according to the words of Christ, and I lie not. Trust me. So we can see that this argument that is found, I think, most fully in the New Testament, in the long ending of Mark, which gets quoted in the Book of Mormon, that this argument gets fleshed out. And it's so important to the author of the Book of Mormon that he says the argument once in Moroni chapter 7, and then he repeats the same argument in Moroni chapter 10. I think that's an indication that this is very important to the author of the Book of Mormon. Okay, so having established the importance of spiritual gifts to the author of the Book of Mormon, let's look at how it uses 1 Corinthians 13 in Moroni chapter 7. Although the list of spiritual gifts is given in 1 Corinthians 12, the following chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, uses language that has traditionally been used to argue that spiritual gifts would diminish and fade away, and all that would be left is faith, hope, and charity. I remember this from my days as an apologist for the church. This was a regular chestnut that those who believe that spiritual gifts did not continue use this passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, by the way, in order to support their cause. And those who believe that spiritual gifts do continue typically go to the long ending of Mark to make their case. The main scriptures indicating spiritual gifts will cease are in 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 10, which states that prophecies will fail, tongues will cease, and knowledge will pass away when completeness comes. Now, this is a different translation. In the King James Version, it says, when that which is perfect is come. So when completeness comes is a different translation of the Greek there. This completeness, or that which is perfect, this completeness is often interpreted as the completion of the New Testament canon, marking the end of the need for those revelatory gifts. And if you've done any apologetic work as a Mormon, you know that this is the argument that is made based upon this passage, right? If you are a member of a church or you have the belief that spiritual gifts do not exist anymore, these are the verses you go to make your case. On the other hand, as I said, if you do believe that spiritual gifts continue to operate and function, then you go to the long ending of Mark in order to say checkmate 1 Corinthians 13. And there's a couple of quotes from 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 10 to establish the point. Prophecies, they will fail. Tongues, they will cease. Knowledge, it will vanish away. And for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. And so the common response from those who believe that spiritual gifts continue to exist has to do with when. When are they going to cease to exist, right? Those who are against spiritual gifts believe that the completeness came when the New Testament was done, so no more spiritual gifts after that. And those who believe that spiritual gifts should continue think that the second coming of Christ is when completeness comes, and therefore the gift should continue up until he comes again, not just until the New Testament was completed. And of course, the belief that spiritual gifts have ceased is called cessationism, right? It always has to have a name. Cessationism is the belief that the spiritual gifts have ceased. And this passage in 1 Corinthians 13 is used to make the case. So, given that, one, the author of the Book of Mormon insists that spiritual gifts will not pass away, but are an essential indicator of salvation. And two, 1 Corinthians 13 contains the one passage traditionally used to argue against the continuance of spiritual gifts. The question becomes, what does Moroni 7 do with this problematic passage from 1 Corinthians 13 while it is borrowing from it? That is the question I pose, and that is where we have the fascinating answer. It is omitted. It is taken out of the Bible. It is glossed over. And actually, it makes sense, because how does the author of the Book of Mormon and the author of this sermon, who has just made the point, as we quoted earlier in Moroni chapter 7, that if you have spiritual gifts, you are saved, and if you don't have spiritual gifts, you are not saved. How does the author of that sermon then quote from 1 Corinthians 13, verses 8 through 10, which has traditionally been used to argue the opposite? And as I say, it is omitted. Let me show you how it's put in 1 Corinthians 13, okay? Going from 7 through 13, and this is the entire passage. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. I'm coming at that point into it because on the next slide, I'm going to go to Moroni chapter 7:45, and I'm going to go from the point in that passage where it is quoting from 1 Corinthians 13, and begin with the part where it's quoting, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. That's why I start there. But it continues in verse 8. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Okay, so having read that passage, let's see what Moroni chapter 7 does with it. And as I say, it omits it. Chapter 7, verse 45, beginning with believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, if ye have not charity, ye are nothing. Now, that expression is taken from 1 Corinthians 13:2. So he has to go back earlier in 1 Corinthians 13 for that expression. But then he goes on, for charity never faileth. That's from 1 Corinthians 13:8. Wherefore, cleave unto charity, which is the greatest of all, for all things must fail. See, it puts in the all things must fail, but it doesn't describe what those all things are, as it does in 1 Corinthians 13. And it is at this point that the passage about spiritual gifts ceasing is omitted. Verse 47 goes on, but charity is the pure love of Christ, and it endureth forever. And whoso is found possessed of it at the last day, it shall be well with him. So the author of Moroni 7 is focusing on charity, saying charity is a good thing, but omitting the part that indicates that spiritual gifts will cease and only charity will remain. Actually, let me say that a little bit more clearly. What it does is it takes away the argument from those who believe that spiritual gifts do not continue. It takes away from them the argument that it could happen at the completion of the New Testament. In other words, it takes away the argument that it could happen before Jesus Christ comes again. All right. So it does say, for charity never faileth. Wherefore cleave unto charity, which is the greatest of all, for all things must fail. Sure, everything's going to fail when Jesus comes again. 47, but charity is the pure love of Christ, and it endureth forever, and whoso is found possessed of it at the last day, it shall be well with him. And then 48, which is the last verse in the chapter and the last verse of the sermon. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, pray unto the Father with all the energy of heart, that ye may be filled with this love, which he hath bestowed upon all who are true followers of his Son, Jesus Christ, that ye may become the sons of God, that when he shall appear, notice it's talking about the second coming of Jesus here, that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Now, that is a reworking of 1 Corinthians 13:12. That's where it says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, right? The face to face part with Jesus. And that's going to happen when he shall appear, and we shall see him as he is, but then face to face, right? That we may have this hope, continues with Moroni 7:48, that we may have this hope, that we may be purified even as he is pure. And that seems to be a reworking of 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. I shall know as I am known. See there, it says, now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And that it gets reworked in the Book of Mormon too, that we may be purified even as he is pure. Amen. That's the last word. Now, there are a couple of places in this last passage where it talks about the second coming of Jesus Christ. Verse 47, and whoso is found possessed of it at the last day, right? The last day, that's generally when Jesus comes. And it talks about it a couple of times more in verse 48, that when Jesus shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, that we may have this hope, that we may be purified even as he is pure. So there are definite references made in close proximity of the second coming of Jesus, which raises the question of whether it is possible that the repeated allusion at the end of Moroni chapter 7 to Christ's second coming, though not stated outright, is meant to be the time when those spiritual gifts will cease and not before. Remember, those are the two main schools of thought. Either the spiritual gifts ceased at the time the New Testament was completed or when Jesus comes again. Obviously, Joseph Smith favors when Jesus Christ comes again. He favors the continuance of spiritual gifts. He continues to favor spiritual gifts as a sign of the truth of the church. And so it would make sense for him to start talking about the second coming of Jesus, indicating that maybe that's the time when these spiritual gifts will cease. This belief in the importance of spiritual gifts even makes its way into an article of faith. Of course, I'm talking about article of faith number 7, which we can all probably quote in our sleep. We believe in the gift of tongues, prophecy, revelation, visions, healing, interpretation of tongues, and so forth. So that's an article of faith of the LDS Church. Of course, in today's Mormonism, there are no more gifts of the Spirit, at least not so many as you could shake a stick at. Although they are claimed, they are not present. And as Exhibit A on this, I'll refer you to Radio Free Mormon, episode 48, the General Conference Death March, where at General Conference, they don't generally tell stories about priesthood power healing people. Rather, they tell stories of people dying anyway in spite of receiving priesthood blessings. So this is why the Book of Mormon ends up undermining and destroying modern Mormonism. This is why the Book of Mormon is so devastating to the LDS Church today. Moroni chapter 7 clearly states that if you don't have spiritual gifts among you, you are not saved. The LDS Church no longer has spiritual gifts among them. So what does the Book of Mormon say about whether modern Mormons are saved? A number of years ago, I was present at a high priest group meeting, and at that group meeting, this passage from Moroni chapter 7 was read in class as part of the manual. And after the class was over, I told a friend, I have never heard a more severe condemnation of the LDS Church than that passage. You know, the one saying that if you have the gifts of the Spirit, then you're saved. But if you don't have them, then all is vain and you are damned. My friend had to laugh and he agreed with me. So, do you agree with me? Tell me what you think of this episode and the arguments put forth both in the Book of Mormon in 1 Corinthians 13 and the argument that I'm making here about this is another indication of how it is we can see what Joseph Smith did with a New Testament passage as he was reworking it in his translation of the Book of Mormon. I think David P. Wright is onto something. I think that his tools are useful, and that using those tools, I am able to see things in the Book of Mormon that I had never seen before. So, everybody, that's all for tonight. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, please leave a comment below. As a postscript to this episode, I want you to know that I got contacted by a person who represents himself as the nephew of David P. Wright. I had called David P. Wright a couple times. I'd left messages on his voicemail. He never got back to me about coming on the show. But David P. Wright's nephew listens to the show, heard the show that I did about David P. Wright, sent that episode to David P. Wright. And my understanding is that David P. Wright listened to it and appreciated it. So I've asked his nephew if he will try and lean on David P. Wright, see if he'll come on the show. He's gotten back to me saying, yeah, David is kind of past Mormonism. He's putting it in his rearview mirror. He didn't say a hard no, though, on coming on the show. So perhaps he can work on him a little bit more. I think it would be great to have him on the show. He's a personal hero of mine. And this podcast is my tribute to David P. Wright. It's what I have been able to see recently in the Book of Mormon that I had not seen before and that I would not have been able to see except for David P. Wright and his scholarship. So that's about all for tonight. Please hit like. Please hit subscribe. Please leave a comment below. Thank you to everybody who's gone to radiofreemormon.org and made a donation. If you haven't done so, please go to radiofreemormon.org today. Make a donation. Make it a continuing donation if you can. It doesn't have to be a lot a month. $5 is all I ask. But if you make a continuing donation, then we are able to better budget and plan things as far as our finances go, what we can expect to have, what we're not going to have, and make adjustments accordingly. That's why that monthly donation is preferred by me, but you do whatever it is you can do. Any donation you can make is appreciated. If you can't make a donation because your finances don't permit it, I understand. I appreciate your watching. I appreciate your viewership. And I would ask, maybe you could share it with a few of your friends and get word of this podcast out and get the subscribership up. That would be great too. So thank you for everybody watching the show. I appreciate very much your viewership. I have a great time going to the Book of Mormon, digging up new things for my listeners to hear. Joseph Smith once said that it is his province to dig up new things for his listeners to hear. At least in that part, I'm trying to follow his lead, though not perhaps in everything that he taught. So once again, that's all for tonight. Thank you for watching the show. Please join me next time. And this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.